get rid of this.
Okay, this is the Baldwin School. Introduce yourself.
I'm Eileen Wang.
I'm Sarah Tarka.
And we will be now entering the oral arguments for Patriots versus Loyalists. Counselors. Question 1. Discuss the role the Stamp Act played in the relationship between Great Britain and the colonies from 1765 to 1772.
The Stamp Act was perceived by the colonists as an abuse of power by Great Britain. The Stamp Act, which was enacted by the British Parliament, was an act requiring colonists to pay a tax shown by a stamp of paper on items such as licenses, newspapers, and legal documents. This was a direct tax, and it was unavoidable, passed without the approval or consent of the colonists, who lacked representation in Parliament. However, Parliament viewed this act as a legitimate method of raising revenue to offset the cost of colonial defense. And the purpose of this act was, quote unquote, for defraying the expenses of defending and securing the British colonies. However, the colonists interpreted this act as a severe unjust exercise of parliamentary power. The Continental Congress even believed that they still owed allegiance to the crown, but it was the undoubted right of an Englishman and essential to their freedom that no taxes were imposed on them without their consent. So this act was viewed by the colonists as taxation without representation, which was not an imposition of economic burdens, but a denial of their political identities as free Englishmen. And they still acknowledged their loyalty to the king, but they rejected Parliament's authority to tax them unilaterally. This significant outcry prompted the colonists to organize against the king through boycotts and public demonstrations and formal petitions. For example, after the act was passed, Patrick Henry submitted 5 resolutions to the king, and similar to many other documents, Henry reiterates his opinion that the colonists are entitled to the rights and liberties of natural-born English citizens. He thinks that the colonists deserve the right to be taxed by their own elective representatives, since that's a fundamental principle of British liberty. This communicates that people chosen by the city will be able to understand the colonist situation better than people in the British Parliament, since the Parliament is so far away that they cannot properly govern the colonists.
Thank you. Discuss how the colonies, and in particular, the Committee of Correspondence, responded to the Tea Act resolution of 1773.
So the American colonies considered the Tea Act an unforgivable violation of their liberty. It was a law passed by the British government to alleviate the financial difficulties of the British East India Company by allowing it to sell directly to the colonies, and they were forced to pay a tax for that tea. It's important to note that this tax had existed beforehand, but was just being enforced now, which definitely contributed to the negative sentiment surrounding the tax. Basically, in their own words, the colonists believed that the tax levied contributions on them without their consent. While taxes such as these are supposed to be an exercise of government, it in reality advances, quote unquote, arbitrary government and slavery. This indictment of the act shows the escalating rhetoric against the British. It's not just a sentiment against taxes, the taxes itself, but an issue about liberty and slavery. This resulted in a strong and unwavering desire to oppose it, as shown by the resolution's extreme and absolute language, going as far as to state that opposition to this act is the duty of every free man in America and necessary to preserve even the shadow of liberty, which was written in the Philadelphia resolutions. This extreme reaction to the Tea Act can't be understood in isolation. Following its passing, there was a lot of planned acts of resistance, such as the Boston Tea Party, where 3 cargoes of the British East India Company's tea was emptied into the sea. Now, this is an incredibly extreme action, and it inflicted a lot of economic damage on the British. So the colonies had to justify it by claiming that it upheld the principle of taxation with representation, for which they had struggled for 10 years. This situates the Tea Party, which is, again, an incredibly destructive response to a simple tax, within the context of a broader battle for just governance and taxation as a whole. While some colonists debated whether this was appropriate, Adams believed that opposition in some form was necessary to defend their rights. Similarly, the Massachusetts House of Representatives' agreement to the Virginia proposal creating a committee of correspondence cited its reason as the British government's systematic invasion of rights and liberties, showing that while it was not a direct response to individual legislation like the Tea Act, it was a part of a procession of legislation that the colonies perceived as a recurring violation of their rights. While the Committee of Correspondence itself didn't respond directly to the Tea Act, it was mobilized to enforce Boston's decisions. This reveals a movement towards tangible action and possible violence, as the committee was given the power to create a group of guards for the ships that landed in the ports that carried the tea. And but their main job was to maintain communications between the colonies in order to be united against the British government. In response to the Tea Act, the people of Boston organized a meeting at Faneuil Hall where they decided that they would not let the tea land no matter what. It must be sent back to England and no tax should be paid on it. Again, they assigned a watch, which the Committee of Correspondence was in charge of, to ensure that no tea was unloaded. This shows that the Committee of Correspondence did have an official role in monitoring incoming ships and making sure that the town's decisions were enforced. Thus, it played a direct role in organizing and enforcing opposition.
Thank you. Discuss how the colonies responded to the Intolerable Acts of 1770.
The colonies saw the Intolerable Acts as a sign of potential future oppression and a tyrannical attack on their liberties, which helped unify the colonies against opposition with the condemnation of the British government. These Intolerable Acts were passed by Parliament as punitive measures to punish Massachusetts for the Boston Tea Party, starting with the Boston Port Act, which was the closure of Boston's ports, since quote-unquote dangerous commotions and insurrections have been raised in the town of Boston. No goods would have been unloaded and no ships are receiving cargo until the East India Company is paid back for the damages caused by the Boston Tea Party. And this act was a punitive measure intended to isolate Britain, and it was also intended to almost reassert Britain's authority over the colonies. However, this act was very poorly received, with a letter written by the citizens of Boston shortly after the act took force, which expresses their outrage at being punished collectively for the Boston Tea Party without being given the chance to defend themselves. This articulates the colonists' indignation at the port, which is their main source of income, and it shows that colonists wanted to cut off all trade with Britain. And the Boston Port Act was the first of many disciplinary actions that were taken against the colonies. So, closely following the circular letter of the Boston Committee of Correspondence, the Massachusetts Government Act was enacted, when Parliament claimed that the colonial government, as existing under its old royal charter from 1661, had become almost too democratic, which led to rebellion and resistance of British authority. This act took away most of Massachusetts' ability to self-govern and placed the colony under direct control of British Parliament. The royal government was granted almost unlimited power to appoint and remove officials and judges. Additionally, local town meetings were severely restricted, and the justice system was placed under British control. However, despite the fact that Great Britain was applying immense pressure through these aggressive acts to reestablish British authority, the colonies unified quicker during these times of duress. It was met with large-scale colonial defiance, seen not only by Massachusetts, but the colonies as a whole, viewing it as a direct attack on the autonomy as an independent system. So the correspondence from the New York Committee of 51, which was a group of colonial leaders chosen to coordinate political responses, demonstrated how the colonies were watching the events in Massachusetts closely and deciding how to best respond. So the letter communicated their sympathies for Boston, quote-unquote, unexampled distress, and highlighted how they, quote-unquote, considered their injuries as a common cause. This letter proposed the idea of holding a joint meeting of representatives of all the colonies. New York clearly states that their unity first mentality, and they do this by stressing how the unanimous resolution must be reached in this quote-unquote fatal emergency. Additionally, after hearing about the many disciplinary acts against Massachusetts, the Virginia House of Burgesses met in Williamsburg to show their support for Boston, adopting the association that promoted an economic boycott of the British East India Company, which urged the colonists to not purchase any kind of commodities by the East India Company whatsoever. And they reiterated that this attack, quote unquote, made on one of these sister colonies to compel submission to arbitrary taxes is an attack made on all British America, which clearly expresses the idea of colonial loyalty, which is one of the first steps to forming a unified American response and one of the first steps to ultimately freedom. The intolerable acts prompted colonists to foster a sense of unity, and the colonists also viewed them as evidence of Britain's growing disregard for colonial rights and personal freedoms as born Englishmen, fueling resentment, and this almost accelerated the colonists' desire for independence. So after the Massachusetts Government Act was passed, Parliament enacted the Quartering Act, which allowed, in cases where barracks were not available or sufficient, colonial officers to find British troops other housing. And Britain felt that because there were quote unquote doubts that had been entertained whether troops can be quartered otherwise than in barracks, this act was necessary in servicing British troops. But the colonists viewed this act as a direct intrusion on their liberties, as it allowed military presence to supersede civilian authority. As the Virginia delegates wrote in the instructions to Continental Congress, His Majesty has no right to land a single armed man on our shores, and those whom he sends here are liable to laws for the suppression and punishment of riots. This widespread perception of British overreach, exemplified by the punitive acts Parliament passed, transformed colonial unity into almost a collective drive for self-determination and independence.
Thank you. Discuss how the actions of the Continental Congress of 1774 moved the colonies towards declaring independence.
Thank you. So the Continental Congress did several things that sort of laid the groundwork for a break with Britain. For example, they provided an ideological backbone by asserting the colonist positions and escalating the rhetoric further by alluding to potential warfare and also taking part in tangible actions such as boycotts. Alarmed by Parliament's actions, the colony selected delegates to the First Continental Congress to deliberate on how to best protect their rights and liberties. The Assembly first talked about its grievances towards the British government, claiming that it exploited the colonies economically through both using explicit taxation and also slightly more underhanded pretenses. Parliament also interfered with the tradition of local governance in the colonies by creating things like customs boards, by dissolving assemblies, and most essentially by crippling the judicial system. For example, influencing judges and sending colonists to England to be tried for crimes. The increase of military presence and the intolerable acts elicited further outrage from the colonists. Through these clear statements of their complaints against the actions of the British government and characterizing them using harsh terms like impolitic, unjust, cruel, and destructive of American rights, as stated in the Bill of Rights, the Continental Congress's charges against Britain identified a logical basis for seeking independence. While their grievances established an ideological justification, they also listed the rights they believed the colonists were entitled to and expressed an ideal of what just governments should look like. For instance, rights such as local lawmaking, taxation with representation, judicial independence, military authority, and the formation of assemblies, and also for colonists who committed crimes in America to actually be tried in America, were listed in the heads of grievances. By evoking the immutable laws of nature, the Congress portrays these as fundamental rights that the colonists couldn't afford to concede. Through this kind of framework of reasoning, the British government's rejection of those rights would leave them with one path: independence. While the Continental Congress's articulation of grievances and rights again provided a backbone for justifying independence, the resolution to boycott British goods and the mobilization of militias further escalated the conflict. In the Continental Association, the colonies agreed to a non-importation, non-exportation, and non-consumption boycott policy. For example, they pledged not to import goods from Britain or any of its other colonies, and they even ended participation in the slave trade, temporarily, of course, and refused to purchase taxed items, also suspending exports to Britain, Ireland, and the West Indies until Parliament repealed offending legislation such as the Intolerable Acts. This boycott backed up the colonists' complaints with actual material actions that are designed to hurt Britain's pockets, heightening the hostility between the two nations. Additionally, the Continental Congress stated that if a colonist were to be sent to Britain to be tried for crime, they would consider this as a de facto declaration of war, as stated in the motion on non-exportation and defense. Furthermore, the Congress suggested that the colonies form militias in case military conflict were to arise, and mainly for self-defense. These references to potential armed conflict demonstrate that the Continental Congress would not passively accept British overreach, instead rationing up the intensity of their rhetoric. This combination of economic pressure and readiness for armed defense exhibits an extreme escalation from ideological argument to measures of enforcement.
Thank you. Describe the arguments advanced by patriots in pamphlets, speeches, and other writings from 1774 to 1776 that supported declaring independence.
Thank you. The Patriots laid their foundation for the argument on the basis of natural rights, taxation without representation, and rejection of the British monarchy. After the Intolerable Acts were passed, many patriots came to the conclusion that a constitutional relationship with Britain that they had traditionally followed was broken. And in the Declaration and Resolves for the Continental Congress, they proclaimed that colonists were entitled to life, liberty, and property and couldn't be taxed without their own consent. The Patriots used this declaration as the cornerstone in their argument to suggest that Parliament's policies had already broken their political bond, following this pre-existing argument that Parliament was stubbornly trying to tax them without proper knowledge of what actually goes on in the colonies, since they have no representation. A pamphlet published in Britain, but written by an American, was worried about Parliament's authority. The author warning that whenever Parliament acted beyond its constitutional authority, quote unquote, taxation and representation united form one of the principal pillars of the English Constitution. This pamphlet emphasized that legal taxes must be consented by the taxed party through proper representation. So by stressing this fundamental aspect, the pamphlet is offering independent support to the Patriots' argument that to impose taxes on the colonists without representation in Parliament is a violation of their legal and heritable rights. Additionally, John Adams also stated that in his own publication, The Evangelist, by stating that Parliament had gone beyond anything to be considered legitimate, noting many times the unlimited power of Parliament used, which extinguished security for colonial rights. Overall, the Patriots used Parliament's abuse of the power as a systematic attempt to control their rights, so defense would not be a rash decision, but almost necessary for preventing political overreach. The legalistic implications in this early constitutional argument framed independence more as upholding their inherent liberties than an open rebellion. Now, by 1775, speeches and pamphlets moved from just warning to a sense of urgency and claimed that Britain intended to subject the colonies to political slavery. In the speech by Patrick Henry, titled "Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death," he argued that the colonies had done everything they could be done to avert the storm, in which he paraphrased years' worth of petition, and that British troops were standing by to bind and rivet us upon those chains, which Britain had been crafting for a while. The employment of the word chains implies the sense of oppression many colonists felt, framing this conflict as an existential rather than just legal and financial. He further advanced the argument that Britain was all along planning the exploitations of the colonies, and the colonies were only just waking up to it in wake of these acts. In a declaration by the representatives of the Continental Congress, they echoed this sentiment, saying that the colonies were being compelled to die freemen rather than to live slaves. The analysis incorporated into these documents indicates that if liberty was to be preserved, resistance would need to escape the realm of just rhetorical, and they would actually have to take action on the warnings that they've been given. Previously, patriots tried to divide their resentment towards Parliament from their loyalty to the king, but by the year 1776, the advocates of independence had adopted the argument that the king was tyrannical as well, coming to the conclusion for a literal call of independence and separation from Britain, including the king. These ideas were more forcefully articulated in Thomas Paine's Common Sense, where he rejected any allegiance to monarchy, calling kingship, quote unquote, the most barefaced falsity ever imposed upon mankind. And he stated that to reconcile with Britain would only place them back under the power of the very men who had infringed upon their rights as freemen of England. He asserted that the colonies had the power to begin the world all over again, meaning he believed that independence was not only morally justified, but also the most pragmatic thing for the colonies to do, which synthesizes the idea that the ideas being developed since 1774, which is natural rights, violating existing constitutional principles, and a monarch who had abandoned his duties. These arguments combined to persuade more colonists that independence was the only option to defend their liberty.
Thank you. Describe the arguments advanced by loyalists in pamphlets, speeches, and other writings from 1774 to 1776 that opposed declaring independence.
Thank you. So the loyalists argued mainly three different things. First, that they were reckless and delusional because revolution was impractical. Second, that reconciliation would be beneficial to everyone. And third, that independence would uproot monarchy itself and give way to another form of government like democracy or anarchy that they considered less desirable. For example, James Chalmers first emphasized the actual logistical situation of the colonists, noting that removing pacifists and loyalists, there would only be about like 60 to 70,000 men available to fight the British, which, I mean, even fully armed, this is incomparable to Britain's larger and obviously better equipped forces. This combined with the fact that the troops would be not only be poorly supplied, but also spread thin geographically and must defend difficult exposed areas such as rivers, kind of guarantees failure. Additionally, he also rejected the possibility of foreign aid. Despite the fact that the colonies have economic leverage over European powers by checking and balancing Britain's West Indies trade and threatening French commodities and Spanish shipping, this actually inadvertently encourages them to aid Britain in order to weaken the colonies. Furthermore, if those nations did support the colonies, this would encourage their own subjects or colonial possessions to revolt against them. So if the colonies do achieve independence, they would also swell in size from European immigrants and expand to conquer nearby territories like Mexico and the West Indies, which belong to those foreign nations. So Chalmers believed that these nations could easily extrapolate such outcomes to supporting the colonies, and they would not risk it. Second, the loyalists found a much better solution in reconciling with Britain because they believed that it would benefit both sides and prevent overall destruction and misery. Many loyalists actually did recognize the legitimacy of the colonists' complaints. For example, they agreed that taxation without representation violated the British Constitution. However, they earnestly pleaded with the British government to consider the colonists' views because in their eyes, reconciliation would restore peace, harmony, union, and also commerce. For instance, Thomas Gage stated that the conflicts between Britain and the colonies should be terminated like a quarrel, like the quarrels of lovers. Chalmers, again, harks back to an incident where the British defended the colonies to remind them of the value of goodwill between the two. For example, he recalled a time when the French had their eye on one of the middle provinces, and they were fortifying the frontiers to prepare for conquest. And the colonies called on Britain for assistance, and they came through with that. On the flip side, loyalists also believed that revolution would cause the British to retaliate against them through, quote unquote, the burning of towns and the setting loose of Indians on their frontiers, which was stated in Arguments Against Independence. William Franklin dichotomizes the colonist choices. One evidently leads to peace, happiness, and a restoration of public tranquility. The other inevitably conducts them to anarchy, misery, and all the horrors of a civil war. The second path, which just stated leads to anarchy and civil war, the loyalists believed is paved by the revolution's debasement of monarchs and condemnation of the Constitution. Loyalists praised the existing system as both efficacious and honorable, boasting that the English had one of the most admired governments in the world. Although some loyalists supported the Patriots' cries against taxation without representation, others accused the colonies of denying the British government the right to tax them, arguing that the supreme power of every community has the right of requiring from all its subjects such contributions as are necessary for the public safety or public prosperity, which was in Taxation No Tyranny. They labeled the Patriots as quote unquote zealots of anarchy, reminding the colonists that they're mediums between tyranny and anarchy, and critiquing the Patriots' comparison of something like simple subjection or subjugation to full-on slavery. According to the Loyalists, the Patriots were frightened by their own voices, and they believed that a hierarchy of English superiority and American obedience could be established without evoking things like chains and oppressions and slavery. Additionally, they critiqued the democratic state as a whole, invoking Montesquieu's warning that democracies are prone to civil wars and internal conflict. They are ever-changing and thus require constant vigilance to protect it from corruption. Chalmers argues that such a system is unfit to govern societies such as the American colonies. In essence, they viewed revolution as both a reckless act that would destroy stability and order, and they believed that preserving Britain's constitutional monarchy and reconciling with the mother country offered the only realistic path to peace.
Thank you. Discuss the Continental Congress's efforts at reconciliation with Great Britain in 1775.
Thank you. The Continental Congress resolved to seek reconciliation by declaring loyalty to the crown and seeking intervention to address abuses perpetuated by Parliament. The colonists requested the king's help concerning the wrongdoings of Parliament and its ministers in the olive branch petition from Continental Congress to the king. Even in calling this the olive branch petition, the colonies had put forth several peaceful attempts to resolve this situation in an orderly fashion. The petition framed the colonies' actions, including military armament for self-defense, as responses to oppressive laws rather than acts of open rebellion or disloyal actions. The colonies represented themselves as dutiful subjects in an effort to appeal to the king's ego and sense of justice. While recognizing that they had the right to dispose of their residues, they attempted to direct their protests towards a tyrannical parliament rather than a just and honorable king. However, despite their efforts, King George III rejected the colonies' petitions, and he issued a proclamation for suppressing rebellion and sedition that stated that the colonies were in an act of clear rebellion against the king. While the Continental Congress remained open to reconciliation, they also firmly asserted the colonists' rights and set clear limits on Parliament's authority. In early 1775, they still sought reconciliation, not revolution, by providing philosophical and moral justification for their resistance, while still not advocating for a full split from Britain. Their efforts began with a declaration by the representatives of the United Colonies of North America, which provided reasoning for why they had taken up arms. And this declaration starts by arguing that no human should have absolute property and an unbounded power over others, and that governments exist to promote the welfare of mankind. They argue that British attempts to dominate the colonies violate natural reason and natural laws, and so they must resort to armed conflict. They also discuss how British officials violated agreements and treated colonists harshly, claiming that, quote-unquote, wives are separated from their husbands, children from their parents. The colonies justify war as defense for future generations, liberty and property, making use of religious and ethical framing by saying, "We most devoutly implore his divine goodness to protect us happily through this great conflict." So they take a very logic and peaceful-based approach to reconciliation, but it also communicates that the Continental Congress and colonies as a whole saw themselves as morally justified, and they thought that their actions were rooted in reason. However, the response to the proclamation for suppressing rebellion and sedition by King George made it clear to the colonists that their efforts at reconciliation were not achieving substantial results. Because of this, the Continental Congress passed a resolution that required every member to keep all decisions and discussions confidential until a majority agreement was reached. This shows how sensitive Congress's work was becoming in the period leading up to the separation from Britain. In fact, by supporting secrecy, it demonstrates how Congress is now aware that they're committing clear acts of treason. And so this agreement of secrecy allowed Continental Congress to protect both its members and plans from Britain so that debates concerning rebellion could take place without outside influence. This makes it clear that Congress was past the point of no return, where they believed appeasement and reconciliation were no longer possible. Now, because of this agreement to secrecy, the colonies are preparing for possible hostilities from Britain, since they were unmoving in the rights they thought they deserved.
Thank you. Discuss the deliberations of the Continental Congress in June and July 1776 that led to declaring independence.
Thank you. So the debates that led to declaring independence revealed a lot of internal divisions between two sides, an anti and a pro-independence side within the Continental Congress. They also disagreed about the legitimacy, the timing and strategy, and even the eventual drafting and approval of the Declaration of Independence. The catalyst for the beginning of these debates was the Lee Resolution, which was written by Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, stating that the colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. The Congress referred the resolution to a committee to draft a more formal declaration listing the reasons for independence. However, opponents of the resolution alleged that it had led to ferment in the middle colonies, for example, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York. These mid-Atlantic colonies were not mentally prepared for a complete break with Britain. In fact, some of their legislative bodies had even given explicit instructions to these delegates to forbid them from consenting to any resolution for independence. The previous November, that was when these instructions were given. On the other hand, the proponents of independence stated that it already existed in reality and merely needed to be formally acknowledged. Simply declaring it isn't willing it into existence, it's just acknowledging a truth. Because in practice, the king had already withdrawn his protection by waging war and ending any allegiance owed to them. The delegates insisted that they could not be denied the power to declare this truth, and the people who they represented supported independence and counted on their representatives to take the lead. Additionally, the king made it clear that Britain would not accept anything less than total submission. Thus, the context was fundamentally changed from November a year earlier, when reconciliation was still possible. The proceedings also considered practical issues. For example, the timing of declaring independence was crucial because the division between the middle colonies and the rest heightened the risk of secession. If a colony's delegates were not given the power to declare independence on their own, other colonies can't declare it for them because they're still independent of each other. Thus, if independence was declared too soon, it's possible that the middle colonies would break off. And something like this kind of schism would be incredibly detrimental to the prospects of foreign aid because, other nations would not want to support a nation that was divided. Additionally, it's unlikely that France and Spain would agree to form an alliance with the colonies to begin with, as they would one day certainly strip them of all their American possessions. Furthermore, the Congress was waiting on a lot of key information. First, the assemblies of the middle colonies would meet within a few days and give the delegates some updated instructions, since the last ones were from November the year before, and things had changed significantly since then. And second, the delegates had sent an agent to France to kind of gauge the likelihood of supporting them in their cause, and it wouldn't be long before that agent would come back. So in light of this, Jefferson felt that the best course of action was to wait for the information and postpone the final decision. Indeed, in a letter from Pennsylvania's legislature to their delegates, they changed their rules and declared that the severity of Britain's treatment of the colonies in things like ignoring their petitions, labeling lawful resistance as rebellion, and most significantly, hiring mercenaries to attack them, had utterly destroyed any hope of reconciliation. and therefore they justified the support of independence. And this was in Pennsylvania's instructions. On July 1st, Congress debated Virginia's motion for independence, and initial opposition shifted as new members arrived, resulting in a unanimous vote from all 12 colonies. Ultimately, these debates and deliberations of the Continental Congress balance political, moral arguments, and also the specific timing and strategy of declaring independence, and also in international considerations, ultimately culminating in the decision to declare independence.
Thank you. Discuss how the text of the Declaration of Independence changed throughout different drafts in June and July 1776.
Thank you. The text of the Declaration of Independence changed from more emotional and bitter to philosophical to formal, matching Congress's preferences. The early fragments of the Declaration, written by Thomas Jefferson, framed the British as unfeeling brethren and that the colonies must forget their old love for them, alluding to the pain of separation, almost like Britain was considered a family who had betrayed the colonies. Moreover, a phrase used by Jefferson, everlasting adieu, was struck out and replaced with eternal separation. The poetic phrasing establishes the fact that this was not just a temporary separation, but a permanent rebellion and separation. And the writing process demonstrates how Jefferson was testing out words and crossing out phrases to refine the rhythm and emotions of the Declaration before the political edits were made, reflecting a movement towards a more formal and less emotional declaration. In the later rough drafts of the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson's tone is moved on from the emotional principles and rooted in physical, philosophical principles, using extreme language to evoke moral revulsion. The philosophical preamble that all men are created equal was added for the purpose of grounding their independence in universal laws, not just the colony's own grievances, stating that the king has waged cruel war against human nature itself. This principle directly evokes John Locke's concept of universal rights. Additionally, he also applies rights through theological principles, divine justice, by explicitly stating that, quote unquote, the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. And here he's introducing a theological foundation for legitimacy. By asserting these principles, he moves from defending the rights of the colonies to declaring the natural God-given rights of humanity. He also makes the additional argument that long-established governments shouldn't be changed for trivial reasons, but when a long train of abuses is perpetuated, then it's their right or their duty to throw off such governments. Here he's connecting rebellion to moral obligation, justifying it based on reason and necessity, while in the fragments he shaped the Declaration based off feelings of betrayal. The Declaration then methodically lists the king's quote-unquote unremitting injuries and usurpations, each framed as evidence for the establishment of absolute tyranny over these states. He used intensely charged language, with each accusation being intended to evoke moral outrage as well as logical conviction, even comparing the colonists' loss of liberty to slavery by stating that the king was violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty, captivating and carrying them into slavery. He amplifies the gravity of moral independence by suggesting that submitting to British power would be the same as accepting enslavement. This statement alone reveals the almost intensity that he was approaching this text to portray revolution as an act of moral emancipation. His extreme rhetoric, using words like tyranny and murder, turns the colony's estrangement from Britain into a moral indictment of the empire itself. By using these arguments and tones in the text, he's framing the colonists' cause as a universal struggle from oppression. However, after he wrote it, a few revisions were made. Sections attacking the people of England were cut because some delegates didn't want to offend them, and the clause denouncing slavery was struck out because South Carolina and Georgia dissented. On July 4th, the Declaration was finalized and signed by almost every member. Conclusively, the early fragments of the Declaration of Independence shaped the moral and emotional core before the political edits came.
Thank you. Discuss writings, speeches, and other sources that influenced the Declaration of Independence.
Thank you. The Declaration of Independence conveys a lot of points that were clearly influenced by previous writings including the notion of natural rights and the right of the people to overthrow tyrannical government. The concept of natural rights originates actually, or ironically, from the English Bill of Rights, which furnishes Britain's subjects with the right to petition the king, right to bear arms, the freedom of elections and parliamentary debate, protection against excessive bail, and so on and so forth. These protections were considered the undoubted rights and liberties of the people, essentially recognizing natural rights by law. Because they were not only undoubted, they were identified in the Bill of Rights as ancient, thus understood to be inherent to all subjects and not something that's granted by the monarch. In John Locke's second treatise of government, he explicitly identifies natural rights to life, liberty, and property. He argued that these rights exist in the state of nature and that governments are formed to protect these rights and did not create them. The colonist writings have long since expounded on these ideas, for example, in Common Sense. Thomas Paine argues against the legitimacy of monarchy on the grounds of innate equality by reasoning that exalting one man so greatly above the rest cannot be justified on the equal rights of nature. The Declaration builds on these principles by stating that men have rights inherent and inalienable, among which are the preservation of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, almost directly harkening back to Locke. The Declaration further contends that a government's legitimacy is dependent on its protection of the people's natural rights, stating that in order to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the government of the governed. So you can reason from this that when a government which was created to protect these rights becomes destructive, it is actually the right of the people to alter it or to destroy it completely and to institute new government that would better protect their rights. Again, these ideas can be traced directly back to Locke, who claims that the people have a right of defense when their right is equally invaded and their liberty lost, and they are made slaves to their own, again, evoking slavery. He frames government as an agreement to act as one body, further corroborating the idea that consent of government is necessary for just government, since it is an agreement and not a decision by authority. The colonists have adopted and debated these ideas. For example, in Tyranny Unmasked, the author responds to loyalist Samuel Johnson's pamphlet Taxation, No Tyranny, which claims that the natural right of people to have consent in their own laws is actually too abstract to be discerned, by stating that he argued against this because apparently Johnson chooses to keep representation off the ground and to make it into a more abstract concept when it in reality was not. Additionally, in Common Sense, Paine describes the hypothetical creation of republican government, affirming its merits by stating that it is held intact by mutual support and community, and thus, quote unquote, the strength of the government depends on the happiness of the governed. He contends that republican government is formed on more natural principles, positioning the consent and active participation of people as the foundation of legitimate authority and not something God-given or enacted by the monarch. Thus, in order to justify revolt, the Declaration delineates the ways in which the British government has violated the colonists' rights in order to prove that they acted tyrannically. Amongst many grievances, it states once more that the king obstructed laws and representation, abused the judiciary, imposed officials and military power, and so on. Going as far as to state that he has waged cruel war against human nature itself, once more evoking humanity's innate rights and natural laws. In the second treatise of government, Locke defines tyranny as the exercise of power beyond right, which occurs when a ruler doesn't use their power for the good of the people, but for personal advantage, serving all kinds of irregular passions like ambition, revenge, or covetousness. More specifically, tyranny involves a threat to people's lives, liberties, estates, and laws, again, stated in the second treatise. King George, in transporting the colonists for trial in Britain, as opposed to trying them in the colonies, hiring foreign mercenaries to fight against the colonists, and quartering British troops in the colonists' homes exemplifies tyranny, as stated by the Declaration. Additionally, levying taxes without consent and imposing trade restrictions is an example of power being used towards private ends rather than public good. Locke also specifies that tyrants employ arts used to elude the law, which is kind of similar to the king's undermining of justice by again sending colonists to Britain and also denying trial by jury. Thus, the colonists, by listing grievances against Britain, establishes the tyrannical nature of their actions. So by doing this, they are providing justification for independence. Ultimately, the Declaration frames their revolt as a necessary response to tyranny, which is grounded in natural rights and principles of government articulated by Locke.
Thank you. This concludes our oral argument. You may press the unrecorded button.